You're going to do like 5 controls or things and divide them up into 3 different stages right now. And they have it's not tight, it's not over. It's something. Well, the license they're going to just do it. On the gamers and stuff like that. My son is my son just running computers. He even texts me. This is I'm gonna be whatever, you know, but his GP so they can where he's at like but his service is really intense. And it's just like
That's 6:30. I'll call this meeting of the Township Planning Commission to order. The first item on I had to stop that. The first item is the call to order. The second is the approval of the agenda. Before we get into that, I would like to introduce Arlene Wright. She's a verbatim translator or recorder of our meeting. And she has asked that you be sure to be on your microphones so she can hear clearly and if necessary, correct later on. So we have, I see long booms on all the mics, so you shouldn't have any trouble getting to them. If you can't hear yourself through the speakers, you're not on your mic. Okay. All right. We have an agenda. Are there any suggestions for changes to the agenda? If not, I would like a motion.
Motion to approve the agenda as submitted.
Second. Okay. Can you see the names? Okay. Cop and all, and Mr. Louise with a second. Any further discussion? If not, call the question. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? That's 6-0. Next is, and we don't have them yet.
Mr. Chair, I apologize for interrupting. You just said 6-0.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5. Terry's not here and Dennis isn't here.
Correct.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I appreciate that. So if you would record that Mr. DeHaan is absent with notice and he's in Florida.
Yes.
And Dennis, oh, he had a meeting. He had a meeting presentation on his magazine.
Still there's.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Ms. Weiss, we do not yet have the minutes. Is that correct? So we would have trouble approving them. We'll move on to the next item, which is public comment. So this is a period of time when you can get up and speak to us. Many of you are veterans of doing so. If anybody is not, well, we ask, there should be a paper there that you can record your name and address so we have it for the record, and you'll get about 3 minutes to speak. It's not really a conversation, although we can answer questions sometimes. So start on the left side. Anybody want to go? Thank you, Jackie. And again, if you can make sure the mic is in the proper place.
Let's see. Is that okay? Okay, so I'm Jackie Beck. I have a couple of comments in listening to the last meeting. There was some discussion about removing some of the history from the master plan. And I think that doing so would be a mistake because people aren't, the next time it's revised, people aren't going to consult a history book or go on the website to learn about the history before updating it. And I think it's critical to remember where you've been when making a plan on where to go and where you are now also. So I would suggest keeping it in the master plan and just updating it as well to reflect where things, how things are now in the sub areas. If you move it, then it risks getting like overlooked the next time the plan is updated. Plus, it's interesting. Second, and the main thing that I wanted to talk about is another thing that you guys mentioned, which is preserving, replacing, and expanding trees. And trees are an extremely valuable resource that is just kind of being destroyed little by little. And so I know there's an existing tree ordinance, and I'm really happy about that, but I would like to see that strengthened, and I'm happy to send in some ideas if that's something you guys would consider.
What was your last? You'd be happy to.
Oh, send in some ideas if that's something you would consider.
We'd love to have them. Thank you.
There will be an opportunity to speak at the hearing portion as well, is that accurate?
Once again,
Will there be an opportunity to speak at the hearing portion?
there's no public hearing on the issues here.
There are public hearings on the ordinance, so there would be an opportunity for the public to speak at the public hearing on the ordinance.
So my comments are on the ordinance, so I guess
Oh.
I'll just wait till that.
Yes, please.
Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you, Dan. I missed that. Okay. Back row? No? Up here? All good? All right. Thank you. With that, I'll close the public comment period. And moving to number 5, where we have a public hearing on short-term rental ordinances. Ms. Weiss, would you like to open the conversation, and then we'll move to Mr. Martin?
I think we could probably just jump straight to Mr. Martin for this one. This is just short-term rental ordinances meant to be more clear, I think, about where we currently stand.
As the planning commission may or may not know, the township has also hired the law firm of Bloom Sluggett to work on the short-term rental matter. The ordinances were drafted by Cliff Bloom and his law firm, Bloom Sluggett. The purposes for them are to try to clarify things because the current zoning ordinance does not specifically include any definition or mention of short-term rentals. That creates confusion in the community. And the first ordinance is to try to clear up some of that confusion and make it clear that short-term rentals would be a defined term and that they would be permitted in the C2 resort service district only, where hotels, motels, and tourist homes are permitted. So that is the purpose of the zoning ordinance amendment. The other ordinance is technically not a zoning ordinance, but it's still been brought to you. It is a moratorium to basically indicate that no permits will be given for short-term rentals for at least 6 months. It also indicates that no existing short-term rentals should be expanded. Mr. Bloom thought this would be a good idea to have a moratorium put in place. It specifically indicates that it is subject to the temporary injunction that has been issued by Judge Halsing in the pending litigation. And so while it would not have the township issue any permits, and again, there are no permits to be issued because the township's position is they're not permitted. So zoning permits, building permits for these things wouldn't be issued. The township is not able to enforce the zoning ordinance, which right now does not allow short-term rentals in the township. So because of that injunction, we can't ultimately enforce and take enforcement action against people. But this moratorium is basically saying, Mika, don't issue permits. Chad, don't issue permits. Nobody at the township's issuing any new permits, and they shouldn't be expanded. But again, we're not taking any enforcement action under the zoning ordinance until Judge Halsing rules otherwise.
Okay.
If you have questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Otherwise, you can hold
Yes.
a public hearing.
Yep. Any quick questions for our council? Okay, then I'll open the public hearing on the short-term rental matter and following the same procedure we just did.
Hi, my name's Katie Johnson, and I'm going to be here speaking on behalf of Park Township Neighbors, who is subject to the lawsuit that Mr. Martin just referenced. We just wanted to come here and talk to you about these two ordinances, as we think they violate the intent and spirit of the preliminary injunction. The moratorium clearly states, it clearly appears to violate this preliminary injunction, and the moratorium says that the preliminary injunction controls, which is obvious. So we just don't understand why putting in this moratorium in any way. And we do think that the judge will view both of these ordinances unfavorably, and view them as some sort of gamemanship around his injunction. So we wanted to make sure we were making these comments to you, and so you were aware. And so we think this will be very frowned upon if and when these new ordinances cause any confusion during the ongoing lawsuit. I understand what Mr. Martin is saying here, but when you publish these ordinances, it may cause confusion from property owners to others, not understanding how to read them. I think they're a little confusing as written. Even the explanation was a little confusing. So if the township tries to prohibit short-term rentals in any way, Park Township Neighbors definitely plans on filing a motion for contempt with the court for violating the preliminary injunction. And so we're just letting you know, because we, want to work with you. And if the township wants to regulate new short-term rentals, that's fine, but all existing short-term rentals should be grandfathered as a non-conforming use, both in fairness to the residents who relied upon the township statements. So the township made statements for years that they were not regulated and they were legal. And because the short-term rentals were legal under the existing ordinance. To the extent the township is trying to use these new ordinances to somehow gain an advantage in the ongoing lawsuit, it's not going to work. We really believe that the judge is going to view these ordinances very unfavorably, and like I said, as gamemanship. And that's why we're coming here today, to talk to you guys, to tell you what we think and what our intent is. We'd rather work something out as opposed to filing a motion for contempt. The law is really well established that citizens have the right to rely on the ordinances that existed at the time of the reliance on the ordinances. So all of us had the right to rely on the 1974 ordinance. And if anything, these new ordinances show how confusing the 1974 ordinance was and how ambiguous it was. So the fact that you have to clarify. So that's all I have to say today. And we're just trying to work with you and give you a heads up that this would be our intent should these ordinances get passed.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And you got your name and address there. Thanks. In the back on the right?
Hi, I'm Joan Zierup, and I just wanted to come tonight and say thank you for the two ordinances that you have been working on. I think they were very thorough and very good, and will go a long way in protecting our neighborhoods. My only comment after the letter that I sent you today was just to work on the consistency of the definitions for short-term rental in the two ordinances, make sure we're consistent there. And then there's some inconsistency.
Could you?
Tourist home is used, and then also the bed and breakfast. It's used in that before.
Tip your mic up a little bit.
Some of the inconsistencies or things that need as well to make sure that it aligns with the short-term rental ordinance.
Okay, thank you. In the back, are you going to speak?
Hi, I'm Patricia Senegor, and I also would like to thank the Planning Commission and the Board of Trustees for working on this, to defining the ordinances that will regulate, that have regulated short-term rentals in our area. And I would like to ask them to be sure to avoid confusion with naming of different residential zones such that instead of such that all residential areas are included under the umbrella of residential area, and they aren't designated by numbers or names, but any residential zone is considered under the umbrella of protection by these ordinances.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, Shar Clark. Shars with an S. So I too would like to congratulate the individuals that contributed to formulating the two new documents. I thought they were very thorough, very informative. I like the way you started and talked through history and rather explained how things started and evolved over time, because going in and reading zoning ordinances can be confusing, and then to have a timeline explaining everything is absolutely perfect. And I think that was well needed. I wasn't privy to any other emails or letters for people commenting on consistency. So I know you can't answer questions, but I hope during your dialogue and questions with Dan, it's discussed what was brought up in the letters with different zoning areas. And that's about it. I think this is a very good job, and I congratulate all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so checking nobody else to speak, then I need a motion to close the public hearing.
Motion to close the public hearing.
Second. Okay, any discussion on it? Call the question. All in favor of the motion, say aye. Aye. Opposed? So 5-0. Now, questions. We did receive some emails, and it looks like I didn't unfortunately have time to get through them, but it looks like there were some good comments. Dan, would you like to handle that?
Sure, I did read it. It was forwarded to me by the community development director. And so I did read the email from Joan Zurup that was sent to the community development director and to planning commission members regarding the short-term rental ordinance. And in that email, along with a sort of compared right version of the draft ordinances, there are issues that are raised regarding inconsistencies as perceived, in particular, in that history section that Ms. Clark brought up, the fact that there isn't a reference to the R4 medium density single and two family residential district or the R3 low density multifamily residential district. And throughout the ordinance, it's referred to as single family residential uses, districts, etc. And so there was some concern about that. Mika and I talked just briefly before the meeting started, and I'm trying to remember as Cliff was drafting these and I was adding some of the history and everything in there, if there was a reason why we focused on single family. And off the top of the head, I don't remember if there was a particular reason, because this was drafted primarily by Mr. Bloom. I would like to consult with him. I don't think it necessarily needs to slow down your process because you'd be making a recommendation to the board.
Yep.
But if there was a reason why these things were intentionally left out, we could keep them out. If it was just an inadvertent omission, they could be put in with your permission to basically have that go that way before it gets to the board.
Let's address these things one by one, if that's all right. So this one is one I had also noticed. And it struck me that it was a little odd, so I would like it looked at.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
I noticed it as well. And I don't know if it's tied to this, but when we were talking about consistency between the residences versus dwelling units. I wasn't
completely following between what we have in our current ordinances versus these, again, in that distinction when we're specifically talking about the short-term rentals. Is if it's truly a single family residence or a single family dwelling unit.
Yeah, the difficulty is, again, we have a definition of a dwelling unit. Dwelling, well, we have a definition of dwelling. And then dwelling is subdefined for one family, two family, multifamily. And one of the things that is, in a sense, going on in the litigation, one of the arguments that's been made is that these are single family residences. And yes, they're designed, developed as single family residences. They can be used as single family residences, but once they start being used for compensation for short-term transient guests, it falls within the definition of hotel, motel, or tourist homes as we currently have. Most people probably thought that a hotel motel is like a Hilton or a Marriott, something like that, not thinking that a single family dwelling could convert itself into a hotel motel based upon the usage. So there's still that dwelling aspect to this. And that is also something that I will raise with Mr. Bloom to make sure that it is consistent. But the concept behind this is, again, short-term rentals of single-family residences are not permitted in the residential zoning districts. They would be permitted in the C2 resort service district where hotels, motels, and tourist homes would be permitted. Keeping that concept that it is a commercial type of use when you're renting your house out on a short-term basis to transient guests for that compensation, it's commercial. It should be in a commercial district. It was a resort use, therefore it's the C2 resort service district, not C1.
So
I hope that answered your question.
It helps.
Okay.
I don't know if it's the appropriate time. I have more questions just about the definitions and the terms that are used. So when we're talking about family, I know we have a definition of a family based on how the short-term rentals are used. What we would think of from daily life as a family, there are oftentimes multiple of those still in a single family dwelling. We also, I didn't see a definition for transient guest.
The transient guest, there isn't a definition for it specifically, and maybe that would be an approach to take. Because that is really where a lot of the confusion comes in. I mean, some of the arguments that's being made in the litigation is that this is still a single family dwelling, whether we're renting it out in a sense to transient guests or not, doesn't create it into a quote commercial establishment, end quote. The transient guest piece kind of comes in by the definition of the short-term rental with that 28-day time. Anything 28 days or less is transient by nature. 29 days or more is longer term. So there's not a specific definition in here. That might be one of the ways that we seek to do it or add a definition for transient. But that's where the dividing line comes in terms of what is not transient. I'm going to write down a note to make sure I can talk about the transient definition.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves on the first issue of listing R4 and 5. I think the minutes should show that council will refer with our other council and make corrections. Should we approve this for going to the board, that should be done between now and when it's presented to the board. So that takes care of that first issue. Is that I'm assuming we're all in agreement on that.
Yes.
And just clarifying, what you're saying is that planning commission would prefer, if it makes sense, to include R4 and R5, all residential districts.
Yes. Yeah, because other ones are mentioned, but those are not.
As long as there was not a legal reason not to do so, is that the
Correct.
Do you want me to continue?
I just wanted to ask, my thought is, because these are numbered things that Mrs. Rupp sent in, and we all have a copy in front of us, that we step through those, that may answer some of our questions also. And then we can kind of hit them one at a time. And then we get into a discussion that tends to be a little more ranging. For this one, we can go through item by item, and I think that would be a good thing to do. So go ahead.
Yes, and I think we've just covered number one, which
Mhm.
dealt with the intent, legislative history, the R4, R5, and single family pieces.
Yes.
The second issue is under the findings, and it is a recommendation to add additional words, if you will, and additional findings. The first subsection A is to add long-term in order to protect the long-term health, safety, and welfare of our districts, of our residential districts. Personally, I'm not sure that we need to add long-term, whether it's long-term, short-term health. The goal is to protect the health, safety, and welfare. So I don't know.
And we also,
Short term, I don't want to, and I know this is gonna sound horrible, I don't want to get any kind of confusion that we're talking about short-term rentals, long-term health, safety. And welfare. I know that may seem silly, but it's really just to protect the general health, safety, and welfare. So that's my reaction to that particular comment.
let's have a quick discussion on it. Health, safety, and welfare to me would include both short and long term. We don't want to say we're not protecting the short term health. So my inclination is, leave it out.
I agree. I'd agree.
Okay.
The next was to add additional findings. And these, I think, are really up to the planning commission. I can run them past Mr. Bloom as well. I know he's drafted some of these ordinances for a number of communities across the state. But there are additional findings that have been recommended as indicated in the email. In that short-term rentals would significantly increase the number of vacant homes in winter months. Short-term rentals decrease the number of long-term residents in the community. Short-term rentals decrease the availability of long-term housing stock, driving up prices and making long-term residency less affordable. And short-term rentals increase the levels of noise, traffic, and parking issues during summer months. Those would go into the findings if, again, the planning commission would make that recommendation that the board include them. I don't know if the planning commission wants to make that recommendation outright, or if it's something that you would want to have reviewed by Mr. Bloom to include before going to the township board for the township board's consideration of the ordinance.
Thoughts? Number B4, IV, whatever. I think that's sort of, isn't that covered in G of the findings? Barking dog, parking ordinances, etc. Noise, blight, local noise. Bottom of the page, page 4.
Noise, blight, dogs. Or my thought on this is I do like the census data. I think it's very helpful to have that kind of information in there. I also think that I would defer to Mr. Bloom to see if he recommends that as well. To me, it makes sense, but I think from a professional's perspective, that would be very helpful.
These are certainly things we discussed when we were creating the ordinance. That these were some of the effects of short-term rentals.
Yeah, and I would add that I think you commented that he's done a number of these.
Yes.
And there's some history, I think, in terms of how these are created and maybe the consistency and how some of the things are communicated. So I would agree with.
Yeah, I would do this as we did the first one, is have Mr. Bloom review them. I don't have a problem if they're included. Anybody, I mean, if they're included, does anybody have a problem with that?
No, not at all.
Okay.
The next issue was under Article 4, seeking to change the period of time from 28 days or fewer to 30 or fewer consecutive days and nights. Then also talking about stating that a tourist home is a type of short-term rental.
Let's stay on just the first one first.
Okay.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
For Joan. Why 30 instead of 28, or you can, maybe you can
So
explain.
there's currently a bill that would use 30 days in the state legislature. It's a bill, it's not yet law. There was a prior bill that was 28 days. The Spring Lake zoning ordinance, which had been upheld by the Supreme Court, and which is somewhat similar to your ordinance, used 28 days. And so the 28 days, 4 weeks, that's where that number came from. It was a number that had been used in the short-term rental registration ordinance. And so there was consistency between this and the short-term rental registration ordinance, rather than looking at a bill that is not yet law. If that bill were to become the law, I would recommend that the ordinance be amended to be consistent with the law, but that bill is not yet law.
Okay. It also strikes me that this deals with a month-to-month rental and covers February. So if you rent for the month of February, you're not in violation. So I would stay with 28.
Except for this year, because it's a leap year. Yes.
But it would still be 28 days, and
Correct.
29 is better
Correct.
or more. So. Everybody's good with that? Okay, next one, please.
The next one talks about the tourist home being a type of short-term rental, which Ms. Zurich indicated she agreed with, but then stated we need to change the bed and breakfast ordinance to align with that. And beds and breakfasts can be in any residential district, so there's a potential conflict there. The difference with the bed and breakfast is that the person, one, it's a special use, the person lives there, and there's a breakfast being offered made for them type of thing. So they are different than what an actual short-term rental is for that potential reason. Nonetheless, because this talks about needing to potentially change our bed and breakfast ordinance, that's something that the staff and attorneys will look at.
Okay,
I don't think it impacts the ordinance that's before you tonight, but it's looking at the impact and consistency with the bed and breakfast ordinance.
right. On the surface, it makes sense.
Correct. One of the things that had come up in the past was with people advertising their homes for rent on Airbnb. Does that make it a bed and breakfast? If they weren't in fact meeting their definition under a bed and breakfast, I think there may have been emails from the zoning administrator in the past saying, no, it's not a bed and breakfast, even if they're advertising it on Airbnb, but look at the advertisement itself. Are they advertising?
It's the use, not the name of the place where you advertise it. Yeah. Okay.
The next item in number 4 also goes to the findings, refers to section C, including bed and breakfast as a commercial or business use. Then again says that beds and breakfasts are allowed in all residential districts. As Ms. Zurich has brought to the planning commission's attention before, the bed and breakfast ordinance needs updating to align with short-term rental. And so again, this is one of the things that we're going to look at. I do think that the bed and breakfasts are permitted as a special use. So there is some
Oversight.
for them. There's records of them existing and they are slightly different. Yes, they are commercial, but again, I think one of the arguments that may or may not be made is if you're allowing a commercial bed and breakfast as a special use, why not what we're doing as a bed with no breakfast? Then noted in the findings, should include in F, we already covered that, the R.
Well, let's finish up with this one. So one of the suggestions here is that we eliminate bed and breakfast from all residential districts. I would like a response on that from the commissioners. And as Dan just explained, a bed and breakfast requires the owner to be resident in the home when there are guests there.
So because we haven't looked at the bed and breakfast ordinance in a while, the bed and breakfast ordinance is a pretty old ordinance and is on the list to be revisited because there are some things that do need updating in it. It requires a special use. You remember that you approved a special use for one recently. It also requires annual licensing, so they need to go through a process every year. I guess, so it's kind of a two-step process. And then I think it's correct that it's in all residential districts. I'd have to check and see if there are any exceptions to that. Requires a site plan review, that sort of thing as well.
Thoughts?
I don't see any reason to eliminate them.
Make sure you stay on your mic, please.
I don't see any reason to eliminate them. I think
Okay.
they're fine.
I don't either. I mean, I know we reviewed an application and had approved it recently and based on meeting the criteria. I mean, we approved it and I was in alignment with what was submitted for the ordinance. Do I think the ordinance needs some updating? Yes, but I wouldn't be in favor of eliminating them completely.
Okay. Glenn?
Yes, I support that. For me, there's a very clear distinction of what a bed and breakfast is. And with that level of clarity and the process that people go through for approval, to me, it makes sense to have that flexibility in our community.
Okay, Don?
Yeah, I would agree. I think the fact that it requires licensing and it has a process for review in a site plan, I think that also supports. Yep.
And just my comment is one of the things that we talked about early on in reviewing STRs was we might allow them if the owner was a resident, because then you would have that control on the situation. So I don't have a problem with them. So. All right, next one, Dan, please.
Yeah, the next one then says to include the R4, R5 in the findings, and again, that.
Yep, same as the previous one.
Correct, consistent with what we've already talked about there. And basically that kind of goes through, in my mind, what we've already talked about, the R4, R5 single family issues are consistent. And then the last item, number 5, talks about the definition of wanting the definition there to be the same as in the STR ordinance, which is the recommendation again of 30 days instead of 28, but we've already covered that.
We've covered that. Okay. I think we're clear on that. Thank you, Joe. We had one more email, which again, I was busy and didn't get to this afternoon or this evening. Dan, have you had a chance to look at it? Or Mika?
Yeah, I think the only other one that I saw was from Mr. Senegor and
Well, that's all he's saying is he is in
he's
agreement.
in support. Yeah.
Okay, good. All right, now comments from the commission on the zoning ordinance amendment, which is definitions and so on. Anybody see anything in there? I had one on page 2. It's just a phrasing issue, just about in the center of the page. That an STR has ever been approved by the township in the township within the ag. It makes sense, but it reads poorly. And I don't know how the township could approve anything that wasn't in the township. You find it?
Yes.
Okay.
I've highlighted it.
And I had one on page 5 also. Right at the top. Says the ordinances can be enforced and might help in some situations. It is an after the fact solution after a problem has already arisen. It works. I'm sorry, it's just phrasing. A solution to a problem that has already arisen, rather than having 2 afters, which I don't like. But that's pretty minor. Anything else? Anybody have notes on there?
Well, I think we had jumped ahead on the first part when I was looking for the transient
Yeah, okay,
definition.
go ahead.
Well, I think Mr. Martin took a note that I'd like to explore including a transient definition in, I think, this section where we're defining
Okay, yes.
our new terms.
Yeah, okay. That could be a legal judgment. Anything else on this ordinance? If not, then we can always have more discussion after the motion. I'd like a motion that the ordinance be reviewed by staff, making a motion. Anyway, I'd like a motion on this issue. Which will end up that we would recommend adoption by the board. We're not approving or disapproving, we're simply recommending, so. Come on.
I'll make a motion that with the changes that we've discussed and reviewed by staff and council, we recommend that this be presented to the board for approval.
I second.
All right, Mr. Milan in a second. Further discussion? All right, call the question. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? 5-0. Okay. And now we're on to the second ordinance, which is relative to a moratorium. So Dan, if you could.
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, again, this was drafted by Mr. Bloom to create the moratorium. You should have a public hearing on this. I was taking again a look at it. He does seem to have this. I'm trying to make sure I'm reading this one. No, I'm sorry. Give me a second.
Yep.
Scrolling.
Yep.
I was seeing the zoning ordinance amendment. So yeah, this is not a zoning ordinance amendment, so it doesn't need a separate public hearing.
Okay.
But it's basically the township saying, again, with the findings about STRs, but that the township will not issue any new permits, that no existing STRs should be expanded, that the ordinance itself is going to be subject to the injunction. As I mentioned, the township is not going to be issuing any kind of enforcement letters, municipal civil infractions, or bringing any kind of action against somebody for operating a short-term rental during that injunction, because that would violate the injunction. The injunction is we cannot enforce our ordinance. We're not going to enforce the 1974 ordinance. We're not going to enforce the new ordinance while that injunction is in place. Whether or not you or the board ultimately thinks this moratorium is necessary, given the injunction, ultimately that becomes up to the board. This is something that we've brought to you for your review. You can make a recommendation to the board. It's again not a zoning ordinance, so it's not absolutely required. It's just basically talking about the permitting issue.
Okay. All right. Comments? What did you see?
To me, the moratorium makes a lot of sense. It's just common sense that you would do that. But to me, it just brings some clarity, and I just think it's a good guiding principle until we have some final direction. So to me, I support it.
I agree.
Yep. I would
Okay.
agree as well.
I'm glad everybody agrees because I have questions. It's a moratorium on issuing permits, which we don't do. We don't have permits for short-term rentals. We do have permits for building, etc. So it seems like it's jumping the gun a little bit. In section 3, A, moratorium on the issuance of any township permit for any STR.
Right, any zoning approval, any variance, rezoning, similar approvals for STRs.
All right,
So there may be times when there would be approvals given theoretically. And whether it be like the ZBA seeking a variance, like a use variance.
okay. Okay, continuing on to B1, it says no STR shall commence, be operated. If I can read it, no STR shall be operated within the township during the moratorium. That's how I read that. Maybe I'm reading it wrong, but we are allowing them to operate
We are, I apologize often for being an attorney and this is gonna sound a little trick-esque in terms of what your definition of is. We are allowing them to operate based upon the injunction, but we're not permitting them to operate. They're not operating legally. So again, I apologize for parsing words, but that's kind of the distinction. And you're absolutely correct, Mr. Chair. While this language says that no SDR shall be operated during this moratorium, we're not gonna enforce it. So why is it in there?
Right, and the next one says no property shall be used. Same thing.
Correct. And so if you are wanting to recommend that that language be taken out before approved by the board, I'm happy to share that with both Mr. Bloom and with the board.
I think it should be reviewed. Because some of the questions we got from the people here is, let's get rid of confusion.
Yes.
It confused me. So, but maybe I'm easily confused.
We do get inquiries and we do have people who are saying, but it's allowed now, right? I can do short-term rentals now. You need to change your communications. You need to make it clear that people are allowed to do this now. And our messaging has been the same. No, the township is not permitting this, but we are prohibited from preventing it.
We're prohibited from enforcing our ordinance. We don't allow them, we don't permit them. We are prohibited from enforcing our ordinance.
But this should primarily be, it seems to me, clarifying that we aren't allowing any new ones. Right, I think that.
Correct, but in all reality, if a new one pops up, we're still not enforcing our ordinance.
Okay.
Because we don't want to be held in contempt of that injunction. So even if new people violate this moratorium and start new short-term rentals, I'm not going to recommend that Mika issue a municipal civil infraction, or that whomever your code enforcement officer is, issue a municipal civil infraction, even a letter saying, hey, you're violating this.
Right.
No, we're not enforcing the ordinance while that injunction is in fact.
If we did in fact have a permitting process, we could say no new permits would be issued. We don't have a permitting process.
Correct. Even with the ordinance that requires registration, there's not a permit that's issued. It's just requiring registration.
Yeah. Okay. And I think everybody else was in agreement. Any further discussion? Then I think it would be good to have a motion on recommendation to the board.
Motion to recommend this ordinance to the board for approval.
Thank you.
Second.
Yep. All right. Further discussion? All right. All in favor, say aye. Aye. And opposed? Okay, 5-0. Thank you. At this point, if we wanted, anybody feels the need for a short break, we can do that. Just get started. We're changing over to work on the master plan. And Ben, I don't think we need you on the master plan. So thank you for being here and helping out. All right. Master plan, we have the final review on two parts, the chapter 3, the sub areas, and the future land use map. So the first thing will be the sub areas. We discussed it at the last meeting and we had a few changes we recommended and they've been made. So, Mika?
The rewritten sections are in blue. So I don't really have anything to add about them other than that I tried to follow the instructions and recommendations that you made last time. So any further comments are welcome. And then after I make whatever changes you recommend, it's going to be formatted very early next week.
All right. Comments, observations? Stephanie, you look like you're on the verge of saying something.
Sorry. I did have one question on page 5. Maybe I missed it last week.
But I thought there was a section online, it looked grayer than printed, under the major sites and neighborhoods. Where it's underlined, starting with this is a popular park. Was that underlined in gray because we were going to look for updated information?
Yeah, so pardon me, Mr. Copenhagen had asked for updated information on that, and I received that, but after this draft went out. So that's just to highlight that that's still waiting for those updated numbers.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Nice.
Otherwise, I did appreciate the adjustments that you made to the street sections throughout. Thank you.
I too like the adjustments that were made. To be honest, I get down to page 3, halfway down under assets and challenges, the last line. I didn't know what extant ownership was, so I had to look that up. So you have to look it up, maybe a word existent or something, but extant just did not hit my vocabulary.
But now it does.
It does now, but I had to look it up.
Sorry, where is that, Lynn?
It's page 3 under assets and challenges, go down to the very last line. And it says extant ownership
extant.
records.
Yep. Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
I have one comment, that's sort of a general comment that on the bottom of the first page, the most recognized symbol of the township, the big red lighthouse, et cetera. And my comment is, but you can't get to it. And maybe we need a different symbol, or we need to somehow get access, because it seems silly to have a symbol that you can't get to.
You want me to include that? The elusive
Yes.
lighthouse?
Yes. The rest of it, I thought it looked good. Mika, I've got a few typos, but no sense going through them here.
I think it looks real good. Just a comment, Mika. Use a color that's more different
Okay.
than blue. Just looked at it, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. It's like, is that highlighted? It's like, yeah, it is.
Trying to keep you awake.
Yeah, right. So I had
I'll
to,
choose a different color
had
next
to
time.
squint at some of that to see that there was a difference.
It did the same thing to me.
Yeah, once I realized it, it's like, oh, okay. It's the areas we
Yep.
talked about.
Works better on a screen. On my computer, I saw it more easily than on paper.
That's how I knew that other section was gray. And then I was trying to find the gray part here.
I think that one of the things, and I sent it in an email, and I think Mika handed it out. I really like the description of what we're doing under the Ottawa Beach Road, the Ottawa Beach corridor. And I just added some language, which was maybe just a little bit more descriptive of what we could do in a master
What
plan.
page are you on there? Let me do
Page
two things.
16.
Once, general, I'm not hearing any large corrections to this. And Len has a suggestion for some rewording in one particular section. So if we're pretty good with the overall, then I'd like to attack this specific one.
Okay.
So go ahead. And what page are we on?
The specific one is on page 16 under Ottawa Beach corridor. The very last paragraph, let me see. You kind of start to go into a description of what it could be. And I was just getting a little bit more explicit on some of the language in there. So it could be too detailed for this level, but also in a master plan, I think you kind of try to paint the picture of what something could potentially be. So I would probably err on a little bit more description than not enough to kind of inspire us. And I believe that this is also one of our implementation actions for coming up next. And I think that helps to inspire us as we kick that off. So that was my thinking behind it.
Okay, you have in front of you email and paper from Len. And if you haven't had a chance to read it, or maybe you can read it and we'll.
Well, I could, yeah, would you want me to read it?
Maybe Len should read it because he wrote
Read
it.
Okay, I'll read it. We have listened to our community and understand the desire for purposeful retail development on Ottawa Beach Road. We have the opportunity of creating an experiential journey from initial entry into Park Township and extending to an impactful arrival at the beach. We can further develop key interaction landmarks with nodes of smaller activity, hubs complemented with artistic visual differentiation and landscape beautification. Imagine a safer flow of car traffic, integrating biking and walking paths with key connecting offshoots for hiking trails. So it's just a little bit more of a description of what an experiential journey could be. So this is actually some language that comes out of books like a pattern language that Dave has. This is actually language from Urban Planning Principles. Images of the City is the name of the author. So I was using some specific language and thoughts behind master planning communities.
Okay. So I know you haven't had a lot of time to look at it and think about it, but I'd like some conversation on it.
I really appreciated the effort and I think it's well put together. I think we've talked a lot about the fact that we don't have a natural center. And that area that we have does have opportunities for a lot more unique development in addition to the park, right? So, yeah, I think about some of the discussions we've had about, agriculture and how we could maybe create some scenarios around there for some of those products to be offered in ways that obviously meet some of the things that we all want to try to accomplish and are important to the residents. So I thought this was terrific.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it acknowledges that, we're looking at the future and have a vision potentially to develop that. So I think it's good.
I appreciate it very much, and I think, and whether Len and Mika want to work together, or we request that, some of the suggested language gets incorporated, I would definitely be in favor of it, for sure.
Okay.
And Mika, if it needs adjusting and condensing, whatever, I mean, I'm open to however you want to look at that, so.
And my comments, I have one question, which is, did our community surveys actually say that there was a desire for retail development?
We didn't ask that question specifically. So I went back and looked at it today when it came to we didn't ask the question, do you want more commercial? We said, if you were to like more commercial, where would you put it? What would you want that to look like? So in response to that question, so that's the information that we have is in response to that question. That information pointed pretty heavily to Ottawa Beach Road as the community's primary, what comes to the top of their mind is, oh, this would be the appropriate place to put that. There was a lot of talk about restaurants. That was a big thing. Waterfront restaurants, as you recall,
Yes.
which is a little bit of a different thing. And there were some other commercial things mentioned as well. So yeah, there was Ottawa Beach Road was kind of singled out for that. But it wasn't a, yes, we want to see less more commercial.
Yeah, the sentence that I put in there wasn't about more. The word that's in there is purposeful. And I think is what you just described is, we're very purposeful on what goes in there. So it's not expanding, but just being careful what we put in there.
Yeah.
Are we thinking more along the lines of commercial rather than retail specifically, or?
So I think purposeful is, in some of the other language in the master plan is, places that in the community you would need to go to get something for convenience, or it could be a lot of different things, but purposeful, we would have to define as we get more detail exactly what that looks like.
Yeah, we have some phrasing somewhere that says area appropriate or something along those lines to serve the local residents.
It is about serving the local residents, yes.
Yeah. I forget the words, but it's
We
like
could,
that.
we could grab some language like that if that helps to clarify.
Yeah. I like the general idea. I think the writing could be simplified quite a bit.
I worked on that forever. What do you mean?
So my opinion, but I'm okay if Len, if you work with Mika on this to include some of it. I think the one thing it does is it's a little more visionary than what is currently written. What we have written now is more functional. This is more, gives a picture. And I think that's good. Yeah.
Yeah, so if I can take this and I'll incorporate it into what's written. Probably just change the language more to match the style stylistically. And I would also say that this would be kind of an arrow pointing to a future action. So if we were going to take on Ottawa Beach Road, that would probably be some kind of corridor study. We would want to get some public input, that sort of thing. So it wouldn't be a, set in stone. That would be just that, hey, this is the direction that we're pointing
Right.
for the future.
It might be green
It might be green.
on our list of things to do.
I'd have to look.
Not red or yellow. Any further thoughts on this section? If not, I don't know that we need a motion. I think we can just say carry on.
Yep. Great stuff.
Next item is the future land use map, which we made some changes to at the last meeting.
So with regard to the future land use map, I think the primary change was adding that ag section. I'm trying to remember if there was another one. All the changes that you've made to date are indicated with those stars. So just for your review. Also wanted to mention, I talked to Mr. Dreyer, Brent Dreyer, one of the farmers the farmer who farms that area that was under discussion last week. And he just wanted to clarify that they're not going anywhere. That was one thing. He walked me through, it was pretty interesting because there are a lot of names on those properties. If you kind of click through them, farms and combinations and family. And the bottom line is that he and his boys farm all of that area. He also mentioned that, this is not a blueberry farm, and his farm operates differently than a blueberry farm. So blueberry farm is blueberries, and it's kind of a single operation where that's what you do. I can't explain his farming operation, but it's more integrated. And so they grow something here to feed to something else here. You can't just kind of piece and parcel that type of farm out as much. You really need to have kind of the whole thing in order to keep the whole operation running. So he wanted to make that point, and that, the fact that Timberline, that stub is going into his land, he's not waiting for somebody to pay him lots of money. He is there to stay, and just wanted to be clear on that. So.
Yeah, from last time we made that future land use map to show that southeast section as ag. And then we also changed the area north of James over to 152nd on the to ag, and that lot west of the one that's being developed to ag. And I think those were the only changes we had from last week. Or it was last week. I don't know how you type. So any other comments, thoughts? Been over this quite a bit.
I did notice that it's now specifically called out as the sewer exclusion boundary. So thank you for adding that clarification for our section last week. And great job getting the zigzag off of the paper we drew here into this map.
So any other comments? Then I think we can proceed with this.
Yay.
There's a happy person.
Mika's so happy.
We're now on to the next item, which is other business and announcements. And Mika, we've got this letter from Holland Charter Township.
Yep, that's an FYI, unless you have comments on it. If you have any comments on it, I can share them back to Holland Charter Township.
The only thing I highlighted that I thought was really interesting is they talk about it would be planned for medium density residential and neighborhood commercial. And since we had kind of a zone that we had kind of thought that is kind of in close proximity to that, it would be really interesting to see what they're planning. So that way it'll help inform, what we're thinking on the township side. So I think connecting on kind of their plans for that development would be very helpful.
I mean, to look at their definition of neighborhood commercial.
Yes.
Yeah.
And what they're planning.
And also note that they're changing it from agriculture,
Yes.
which we're trying to avoid in some areas. Right. If anybody's going to keep agriculture.
And, I guess since we talk about affordable housing in our community here, I didn't see any of that language in this update here. So I was curious if they are developing that anywhere in their community. We're so close to one another. It would be helpful to see what their thoughts are around that as well.
I know that they've done a lot of market rate and a lot of apartment complex. I don't know how much they've done of true affordable housing, like subsidized.
But this is very helpful for us to know what our neighbors are doing.
Very much so.
I did find it just very interesting, or noted the fact that they were changing it from ag to residential. And in my head, I thought, even though we are still neighboring communities, it's another reason why the focus to preserve here is so important. Thinking about the area on this notice, I think logically I can follow probably their line of thinking. And I think it makes sense when we think about how we fit into the larger Holland regional community. But it did for me kind of reinforce the changes that we made last week, seeing this notice.
Yep. Okay, any other business or announcements? Our next meeting is our normal monthly meeting for March. We're not going to have the special meeting, correct?
Good.
Anything else? Then motion to adjourn?
I move to adjourn.
Second.
Mr. Flan, Mr. Capano. Okay, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? 5-0. Thank you. Meeting is adjourned. We may have set a record.